We're going to move to the awards ceremony now. I'm going to start by introducing Adam Hochschild. He's the only two-time winner of the Dayton Literary Peace Prize. His book, Bury the Chains, was the runner-up in nonfiction in 2006, and To End All Wars won the Nonfiction Award in 2012. Adam will be introducing Eli Saslow in his book, Rising Out of Hatred, The Awakening of a Former White Nationalist, winner of the 2019 Nonfiction Award. Adam?
Well, it's a great pleasure to be back here in Dayton and to be able to introduce Eli Saslow. I won't waste your time because it would take a very long time running through the list of his achievements and awards and so forth, which are in your program. As you know, he's won a Pulitzer Prize, but now the jewel in his crown is the Dayton Literary Peace Prize. I got to know Eli Saslow's writing because I teach a course at the Graduate School of Journalism at Berkeley. And I'm always looking for examples of really good writing to show my students. And examples of people who are writing not about political leaders, not about celebrities, but writing about ordinary people and making us care about their lives. And that's what I've always found in Eli's work, whether he's writing about a child caught in the terrible crisis at our southern border, whether he's writing about a salesman who is struggling to stay afloat economically in difficult times. He brings the lives of people we don't know about alive. One of his stories that deeply impressed me was a story he wrote in the Washington Post magazine a few years ago about Derek Black. And then I got very excited when I saw that he'd written a whole book about Derek Black. Some of you by now have read the book or have heard about it, and it's an extraordinary story because Derek Black was born in the white supremacist movement, or white nationalists as they call themselves these days, and he was, so to speak, the crown prince of one of the leading families in that movement, which ran the website Stormfront, the major site for white supremacists in the United States. His father, Don Black, was a former Grand Wizard of the Ku Klux Klan in Alabama. His father's best friend and Derek Black's godfather was our best-known Klansman, David Duke. And young Derek not only grew up in the family that maintained this website, but he was something of a child prodigy and had a lot to do with shaping the rhetoric that was used on this site while he was still a teenager. I was deeply moved by the story of how this young man gradually turned away from this movement and became an eloquent voice in denouncing it. It's a story that is beautifully told in Eli's book, Rising Out of Hatred, partly because Eli got everybody involved in the story to talk to him. And I'm going to have to get some tips from him on how to do that I can apply to my own work. It was a moving story because it shows how someone can change when confronted with a world that's wider than the world that he grew up in, and when confronted as friends with precisely the sort of people he had been trained to hate: Jews, Hispanics, people of color. And in today's world, when we have on every continent, from India to Turkey to Hungary to the United States, authoritarian leaders who are peddling hatred, I feel very inspired by this story of someone who renounced hatred, because I think that's what needs to happen throughout the world. So I give you Eli Saslow.
Thank you so much. I appreciate it. It's very nice to be introduced by a two-time winner. That's a good way to stay humble. Give me something to shoot for. I appreciate it. I also just want to start by thanking all of you here. The whole community over the last 2 days has given all of us, I think, who are being celebrated here so much support, so much kindness, so much love for us to invest back into doing this work. That is so meaningful in a job that is oftentimes very solitary, where it's like sitting and looking at a page and trying to make sentences fit together. So this is a huge gift for us, and I'm really grateful. Also, a gift, I'd like to thank the food service staff and everybody here. The food was phenomenal, and thank you for putting it together. Sometimes before I speak, like I feel too nervous to eat, and this was food that conquered my fear, so I'm very appreciative. Also, I'm at table 20. Please leave the dessert. That part's coming next. This is sort of a remarkable full circle moment for me in terms of landing at a spot being celebrated for work that created peace, because the truth is the origins of this book were from the exact opposite place, from a place of real profound darkness. In my work, my day-to-day work as a journalist for the Washington Post, I write long stories about the big impacts of the main issues in this country on people's lives. And it's impossible to do that job, or to do that job well, without writing often about the long tail of white supremacist ideas that have formed this country and continue to inform the country that all of us live in. Sometimes for me that means writing about the impacts of anti-refugee rhetoric and what that's doing to people's lives, or the way that immigration and our conversation about immigration is changing in this country, or criminal justice and the institutionalized racism that's still so much a part of the United States. Unfortunately, it's also meant increasingly going to a rising wave of white nationalist terrorist attacks, mass shootings that happen in this country at an accelerating and terrifying rate. So for the Washington Post, I was sent to Charleston, South Carolina, a little bit more than 4 years ago now, to write about what had happened in a historically black church there, where a white supremacist had radicalized on the internet, had gone into a historically black church, and had murdered 10 people. And I went there to try to understand how somebody could come to these disastrous conclusions about race and what our country is in the America of, at that point, 2016. In researching and learning about Dylann Roof, I learned that he had come to a lot of his conclusions on this place called Stormfront, which, for those of you lucky enough not to know about it, as I was then, I'm going to ruin that for you. But it's the largest sort of racist epicenter worldwide on the internet. At its peak, it had 300,000 registered members. It's translated every day into 5 languages. It is the epicenter of hate online. And in learning about this place, I learned about an opposite story. The rising heir to this movement, the person whose father had built this message board, who had de-radicalized and who had wound up on the far other side, fighting back against his family and trying to undo the damage that, frankly, he had done and that his family was continuing to do, and somebody who was becoming sort of one of the country's young, prominent anti-racists. So I began to pursue that story instead. The true courage in my work as a journalist always rests with the people that I write about. The risks are inherently theirs. I'm asking them for trust, and I'm asking for the ability to write about their lives honestly and to tell their stories. I'm also filing open records requests so that I can know everything that the FBI knows about them. I'm doing all kinds of archival reporting, but mostly my work is I'm going and I'm spending time there with these people in person. And the people in this situation who did the active work of creating peace were mostly students on a college campus that once they realized that this person, Derek Black, was in their midst. At that point, he was 20 years old. He'd been elected to office in Florida. He had a mainstream show on the airways in Florida every day, spreading white supremacist views. And when they learned that this student was on their campus, they made, I think, universally the courageous choice to do something, as we heard about here earlier today. They invested themselves. It would have been very easy for them to say, we're not going to change this person's mind. His father was the head of the KKK for 10 years. He still is on the radio every day saying horrible things, sometimes about us and people who look like us. Instead, what the students did, and they had very different ideas how to do it, is they said, let's change him. Let's do something. Let's talk to him. Some of them said, let's protest him. And that was a huge act of courage, too. Many of the students of color on this campus, they didn't feel safe going up to the future heir to the white supremacist movement and saying, can we talk about some of your ideas that have been dehumanizing me again and again, century after century? And so what they did is they said, we want to make him feel uncomfortable. We want him to feel some of the things he's been making us feel for a long time. And they shut this campus down. They canceled classes at this college for a day and a half. And for the first time, Derek began to see in the eyes of what he considered in some ways a peer community. These were smart students. They were at the college that he'd gotten into. He saw how his ideology made them feel, and that made him feel vulnerable for the first time. So then, when other students decided to make the opposite choice and decided, instead of confrontation, let's try invitation. Let's see if we can build a relationship with him, and maybe if he spends enough time with us, and us being Jewish students who he'd been saying horrible things about online in his childhood, students of color, new immigrants to the country, and also white allies, them saying, maybe if he starts spending enough time with us, maybe if he starts hearing about our experiences, he will begin seeing past his prejudices to the people and to the humanity. And this took a lot of time. The work of transformation is not something that happens quickly. Our country's history obviously bears that out, but also the work of personal transformation takes time. So week after week, year after year, over what took 4 years, which is the story of this book, these students did not give up on Derek. And Derek also, in his own act of, I think it's hard to call it courage, because the truth is disavowing and fighting back against racism, I think, is an act of basic human decency, but he lost a lot for switching and doing it. And I think I always want to make sure that the true courage rests with those people. Those are the people who decided to trust me and spend time with me in all of these different places and become public in a book that for many of them has put them at not insignificant risk as the people who did the active work of changing the future heir to the white supremacist movement's mind. I think for me, there were 2 lessons in this project. One was, the scariest part, spending time with these sometimes white supremacists, as I tried to learn about how they had very tactically mainstreamed their ideology and continued to grow it. The scariest part wasn't the questions that they would ask me about my last name or the Judaism in my own family. The scariest part was hearing from them again and again that they feel like they're winning. They feel like their ideas have grown in our country over the last years, and unfortunately the data bears it out. I mean, on college campuses, where I got to spend a lot of time this week, hate crimes have risen by 3 times in the last 4 years. Incidents of racist and Nazi graffiti are doubled over what they were 5 years ago. It's not just on the far terrorist extremes where we see this ideology. I think it's also in a lot of the mainstream talking points that I read 5 years ago on Stormfront about immigration and refugees that are now a much wider part of the language we use for people to dehumanize them all the time in our political spaces in this country. The other lesson from this book is that we can do something about it. If the future heir to the white supremacist movement can be forced to confront his ideas and wind up so far on the other side, it gives me some faith that all of us can go about the work of confronting and transforming the much more insidious, pernicious racism that is still at this country's core. I hope that the stories of these students and the work that they did can inspire and empower you all to continue to do that work in the same way that you all have inspired and empowered me by celebrating this story to invest that back in the work I'll continue to do. So thank you very much.
Obviously these are difficult times for journalism right now, in the business of journalism. And it's not just on the business model of it, but also you hear the fake news, the enemy of the people, and the biases that are being formed against journalism. And I also think it's a golden age, and people like Eli are a perfect example of that. If you put the care into the quality of your reporting and your writing, the commitment to truth will win out. And I think that's just a really important lesson to learn from people like Eli.